Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Age of DDoS Requires Big Data Analytics. We're getting ready to get started here, so I want to just briefly orient you to who's speaking today. My name is Henthorn-Iwane. I'm VP of Product Marketing here at Kentik, and today we have a wonderful guest who is Joseph Blankenship. He's a Senior Analyst at Forrester Research in the Security Risk practice. So I'm looking forward to this time together with Joseph to share some interesting trends and recommendation information, get some feedback and participation from you from the audience, and then take some question and answers. So we're going to be covering a few different topics here, and Joseph and I are going to alternate, not exactly dueling presenters, but definitely alternating and how we go in order. And these are the topics we're going to cover, and then follow by some Q&A at the end. And in terms of the logistics, I want to just point out that the audio is voice over IP by default, but you can change the audio and join via selecting the telephone. If you have questions, there's a questions panel that you can type questions into. We will collect those and address them at, if possible, right away, but most likely we'll get to those at the end during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation time. There are also some handouts that you'll see, some resource documents that you can access and download, and we're also going to run a couple of polls. Speaking of which, I'm going to launch a poll right now, which is on the topic of what is your primary business interest or concern with DDoS. So you can fill out that poll, and that'd be great if you can start filling that out. And then we'll take a break in a little bit to feedback the response from our attendees on that. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Joseph to get us started.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. Much appreciated. See, I don't know if you need to advance it beyond the poll once we're got all the responses in. Anyway, as Alex said, I'm Joseph Blankenship, Senior Analyst at Forrester Research. If you're not familiar with Forrester, largely what we do at Forrester is we are a research organization. So we work with vendors like our friends here at Kentik, as well as end-user clients like yourselves, to understand what is going on in various industries, one of those being security and risk. That's the practice I'm a member of. So I work with a lot of our end-user clients to help them with things like security strategy, product or service acquisition, and help them understand coming trends in the security space. And I also work with vendors like Kentik to help them understand user needs, help them design solutions and strategies that will help solve end-user problems, et cetera, et cetera. And I think I mentioned that we're a research organization, so a lot of what we do is driven out of really large research surveys that we do throughout the year. And one of those large surveys is our annual Security and Risk Survey. So with our Security and Risk Survey, basically what we're doing is we're reaching out to security decision makers all over the globe and asking them questions about what kind of problems are they having, what are they seeing. So there's some of the information that I'll be relaying here, as well as some information relating to some of our most recent research covering DDoS, as well as some of the threats we're seeing coming out of the Internet of Things. See, Alex, I don't know if we can advance the slides here. There we go. Okay. All right, so let's get into DDoS trends a little bit. Speaking of the research that I talked about just a moment ago, so one of the questions we asked our respondents is, were you the victim of a data breach or an external attack in the previous 12 months? And our respondents told us, that 30% of them did suffer a data breach as a result of an external attack. So what you're looking at there in the bar chart, sort of the breakdown of those respondents that said, hey, we did have a data breach that resulted from an external attack. And this is how the attack was carried out. So kind of looking at the top down, you can see software vulnerabilities still lead the way in terms of the way that data was accessed by external attackers. But sort of our subject matter here is a little further down, with 25% of those breached saying that they were breached as a result of a DDoS. And a lot of times what we find with DDoS is that DDoS can be a subterfuge or a disguise to distract the security team away from the real event. The real event being the exfiltration of data. Perhaps there's been an ongoing exploit in the environment, and then the DDoS attack is carried out so they can safely for them, that is, not safely for you, get the data, the targeted data, out of the environment without detection. And DDoS attacks have increased year over year for the last few years. This data goes back to 2014 on this little trend. And it's interesting to me, having followed this space for a long time, that we didn't really see a lot of DDoS attacks for a while. Then we saw a ton of DDoS attacks, and then it kind of hibernated again. And then just this past year in 2016, we saw another kind of burst of DDoS attacks. I think that sort of follows the typical cat and mouse that happens between the attackers and the victims and the vendors, right? As our mitigation technologies improve, it's really easy to shut down, one-off types of exploits or attacks. As the attacks grow or get more sophisticated, then our technologies have to get more sophisticated. Our approach has to get more sophisticated. We just saw, sort of the next generation, I think, of attackers this past year, which is one of the reasons for the again increase. So why do people do this? This is a question I think a lot of us have, especially those of us who have been a victim of a DDoS attack. Why on earth would anybody go through the trouble of attacking somebody? As you can see here, it's for a lot of different reasons. It could be hacktivism. We saw that a lot in, I think it was a 2014 time frame, with the attacks that really targeted the financial sector, trying to make a point about how people felt about financial services and banks. It could be ransom, and this is something that we're seeing a lot of right now, not only with DDoS, but also with something called ransomware, that you may be familiar with. And that's kind of under the category that I call digital extortion, right? Where we're using the DDoS, or we're using a ransomware as a means to monetize an attack, to extort money from whoever's being targeted by either inconveniencing them or costing them a lot of money. As I mentioned before, it could be a diversionary attack. I may want to DDoS you to distract your security team, or so to inundate your network traffic so that you can't immediately detect what I'm doing. What we've seen, in some things like online gaming, is that it could be a competitive situation where one competitor may target another competitor. If you follow blogger Brian Krebs, he has done a series of exposés that talk about this, specifically on how different competitors in online gaming have targeted each other and sort of made an economy out of DDoSing each other. And then lastly, it could be politically motivated, and that political motivation may be from other government organizations. It could be from one political entity targeting another political entity, et cetera, et cetera. But the point of it being that we want to influence a political outcome or make a point. Hey, we're taking this down, and here's our statement. Kind of akin to protesting and getting a word out by disrupting commerce or something of that nature. And as a result, we are adopting DDoS mitigation technology. One of the things that we've seen is that people are most often choosing to adopt this as a service. Why? Because you don't always need a DDoS, so you may want to opt to do that as a service, most likely a cloud-based service, where when in an event of an emergency or of an incident, you're able to turn that on and immediately begin mitigating the problem. So this is some more some other response from our security survey, and you can see that the number of people implementing or having already implemented DDoS has increased from 2015 to 2016. And this is specifically talking about DDoS as a service. And we'll get into some mitigation recommendations and recommendations for future planning later in the presentation. I just want to give you a flavor for what are people doing and how are they thinking about how to mitigate DDoS. And looking specifically at DDoS as a service overall, 77% of our overall respondents to the security survey have either already implemented or planning to implement DDoS as a service. You can kind of see the breakdown. And this is really focused on our 2016 data. What we saw right before this was kind of showing the trend from 2015 to 2016. So you can see there's a subset there, not really interested, another subset interested, but no real plans to do this, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things I've noticed that is true of almost all cybersecurity, not just DDoS, but we sort of wait until there's a compelling event until we take the action, right? We either need to be targeted ourselves or find that someone in a related industry or one of our peers in industry has been targeted, and that's usually what starts getting people thinking about, wow, I really need to have a plan for this. And I think DDoS is a perfect example. It's not necessarily core to a lot of people's security strategies, but it is necessary in terms of business continuity and planning. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Alex to cover a few things here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joseph. So I'm going to do an add-on take on DDoS trends, which is going to be a little more technically focused. But before I do, I want to just cover briefly who is Kentik. You may not be familiar with us, and so I'm just going to touch on that, and partly to give you the perspective that we're coming from, which is we provide a SaaS and big data platform for network traffic intelligence and DDoS defense. So DDoS defense is one of the use cases we address with big data intelligence, traffic intelligence. We are currently taking in over 125 billion network data records per day. We have over 100 customers, and our founders came from the background of building and running very large networks at places like Akamai, Netflix, and YouTube. And our customers are a mix of different kinds of enterprises, including a lot of digital enterprises, as well as various types of service providers, ranging from large telecom organizations to hosting companies and regional service providers. So in my trends, I'm going to be addressing some of those different concerns. In terms of the DDoS landscape, there's a huge taxonomy of different types of attacks, but to simplify somewhat, you can think of these attacks in different categories. One would be volumetric attacks, which are really seeking to overwhelm resources, server, and oftentimes even network resources by sheer volume of traffic sent. And that's one type. So it includes flooding types of attacks, etc. Another category is what you might call low and slow attacks, which seek to target particularly server resources by playing out slow connection requests and other sorts of resource requests, and then just keeping them open so that eventually the target's resources are exhausted. And then there are application layer attacks, which exploit specific layer 7 protocol and application limitations as well as flaws to prevent normal function. So there are HTTP-specific types of attacks. You could argue that DNS amplification is both an application layer attack as well as a volumetric attack. So some attacks don't fit neatly into one bucket or another, but these are some helpful categories. In terms of the landscape of these attacks, one thing that's interesting to note that is if you think about a higher level categorization between very application-oriented DDoS attacks and infrastructure-oriented attacks, the infrastructure layer attacks are the vast majority today. And it's interesting because this somewhat changes over time, but it's remained consistent in the mid to high 90s, I would say, 90th percentile being infrastructure attacks. And the different attack vector frequencies tend to, if you look at a graph over time, you'll see that the mix changes sort of on a fairly regular basis, mostly because attackers change techniques in order to get around certain types of defenses, or they just evolve the way that they launch their attacks. It's not a consistent mix, but there is a pretty broad mix of different attack vectors. In terms of the bandwidth of a typical attack, the news has contained a lot of stories about the most spectacular attacks, and those are very concerning. But the majority of attacks are under 10 gigabits per second, and so there's sort of a sweet spot in the gigabit, around the gigabit range, and under 10 gigabits per second. So this is the typical bandwidth. Where did DDoS attacks come from? This is another interesting thing, is that there are definitely common geographical sources of DDoS attacks, which can influence how you understand the way to defend against them in terms of alerting and detection policies. And this distribution does change over time somewhat, but there are some very common actors that are in this mix. Unfortunately, China oftentimes being the lead source country, but the US, UK, and other countries are very, very common as well. In terms of when your organization is the target, visible digital brands websites get attacked a lot. It's really constant for them. And once you are attacked, there's a very high probability that you'll be attacked again. And top target organizations are receiving multiple attacks per day. You can see from this chart that on a quarterly basis, there's the average number of attacks per quarter runs in the 20s, and now it's popped up to about 30, at least according to Akamai. Now, if you're a service provider, depending on what kind of organization you are, you may have different concerns. If you're a broadband provider, ISP, particularly if you're serving consumers, then the preponderance of attack traffic is actually passing through your network. A lot of these are gamers attacking each other, but the major concern is preventing or dealing with collateral damage to the network and to service levels to everyone else. So oftentimes the concern is as much quarantining that attack traffic as cleansing it. If you're a large telco or mobile operator, attacks on DNS and NTP and mobile infrastructure is a reality. What's interesting is that as the bandwidth capabilities of mobile connections grow, I think we're going to see the ability to launch volumetric attacks from more and more mobile devices, whereas that's mostly been the domain of hardwired connections in the past. And then there's another whole domain, which is that many service providers want to offer or are offering security and DDoS protection service offerings, and they are an important revenue growth opportunity for a lot of service provider organizations. If you're a hosting company or a regional ISP, you may want to offer this as an add-on. And many telecoms large telecoms have made investments in DDoS protection services and are in the phase of investigating perhaps second generation techniques and technologies. All right, so I'm going to turn things back over to Joseph at this point.
Thank you, Alex. All right, so let's talk a little bit about IoT as a cyber weapon. And years ago, not too very long ago, if you had asked me about IoT and IoT security, I probably would have laughed at the very thought that one day my toaster or my refrigerator would be attacking me, right? I kind of thought the notion was a little bit silly, considering that most of the devices are fairly dumb, don't really have operating systems, and don't really offer a lot for an attacker to do on the actual device. And then lo and behold, we started coming out with all kinds of things that were Wi-Fi enabled. I think one of the funniest ones I saw recently was a Wi-Fi enabled slow cooker. So I suppose you could be at a remote location, you could be at work, you could be in your car, and you could monitor your pot roast remotely and make sure the pot roast is going to be ready by the time you pulled into the garage. So all this convenience has sort of led us to this whole idea that not only could we spy on the IoT devices, but we could also use the IoT devices. We could weaponize those things. We could weaponize these dumb devices and make them, do our bidding if we made them part of a really large botnet. And we saw, the really big evidence of that in 2016 as the Mirai botnet kind of got its notoriety and its time in the spotlight. Starting with Brian Krebs getting hit with a record DDoS attack back in September, and that botnet was largely made up of things like webcams, printers, DVRs, and home internet routers. So you can think about all of these things that you may have in your home or you may have in your business that you really haven't done much security work on, or really thought about, how do I either, if I can't secure the device itself because it's a dumb device, then how do I keep this device from being taken over and either used as a weapon against someone else or as a weapon against me, internally, right? Or how do I, keep these things from being taken over? It's really something we've got to think about when we see the results of something like the Dyn DDoS attack against the DNS service provider Dyn that was hit in October last year. What we saw from there was it was kind of a cascade downhill, right? Not only was Dyn as a DNS provider affected, all of Dyn's customers were affected. And if you were, trying to use maybe your favorite, SaaS service or cloud service provider, trying to log into some things, you may have had some real difficulty that day as they came to grips with that denial of service attack that all came from Internet of Things type devices. So as security people, it's really something we now have to take very seriously and not laugh about as I did just, a couple of years ago. And what does that look like? So this is from a recent report from Forrester about the IoT attack surface and how it transcends the digital-physical divide. This kind of just breaks down the timeline behind Mirai from the time that KrebsOnSecurity.com was hit until the time that the Mirai source code was actually made publicly available, which now has led to many variants of the Mirai botnet and many copycat types of things, other botnets existing. Right, so Mirai is not our only worry any longer. We've also got to worry about kind of copycats and different variants of Mirai. So you can see here from the timeline that it doesn't take very long from the first time that we see something and it has a really large impact to we start seeing a lot of variations of the theme that are now impacting people downstream. I think I clicked one time too many. Here we go back. Oh my gosh. Alex, I'm having a hard time seeing the controls. I don't know if you can get us back on track from your vantage point. Anyway, I'll get into this. So the next slide is about the DDoS Internet of Things attack surface. There we go. So if you look at, there's different attack vectors that we can take advantage of, right? Anything from things like web applications that can be taken over, mobile devices, sort of system on a chip type technologies, et cetera. I don't know if somebody is off mute and may need to mute. Network protocols and wearables. So these are all different aspects of things that attackers can take over and take advantage of in order to compromise the device. And either compromise that device for weaponizing the device or to spy on the device. You may have heard tale of things like people hacking into nanny cams or baby monitors, those types of things, to listen in on conversations or to record or watch things going on in rooms. This is one of the many reasons I do not have anything that is Wi-Fi enabled in my home, providing home automation. So if you've got those kinds of things, you may want to consider what are the precautions that I can take. Is there the ability for me to change the password on the device instead of using whatever the default password is? Is there the possibility that I can harden my Wi-Fi in my home? so that an attacker would not have access to that device, et cetera, et cetera. And definitely, since we don't have any standards or any real testing from the manufacturer community, it's really kind of up to us as security professionals and as consumers to make sure that we are, doing our best to see that our devices are secured, the firmware is updated as we're able to get the firmware updated. And in the case of corporate networks, that we're segmenting those devices properly so that they can't be compromised. Well, we polled people in our survey, and now if you can forward that again, the controls are just not coming up. As we talked to people in our survey, 54% are really concerned about the risk that IoT technologies introduce to their firm. And you've got to think, a lot of these survey respondents are in environments where IoT devices may be sensors on sensitive types of equipment, where that could be utility providers, energy providers, or the electrical grid, pharmaceutical companies, manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's a lot of different concerns there. And if you look at sort of the bar chart there, it's everything from external hackers to people doing denial of service against the device itself. How can we disrupt the device so then we can disrupt the process inside the organization? And then, as I mentioned before, the third there being the third-party collection of device usage. Are we able to spy on this company and figure out what they're doing? You can see some of the other things. So as a result, in 2016, 67% of our security decision makers rated these types of privacy violations as one of their highest levels of concern as they were thinking about IoT initiatives. So it's definitely something that's becoming top of mind as it's also in the news for all of us. And now I'm going to hand it back over to you for the next section here.
Okay, thanks, Joseph. So I'm going to cover the state of DDoS protection, particularly in light of the increasing attack sources, the severity of attacks. What is the state of DDoS protection now? I think a first thing that's helpful to look at is, what does a DDoS defense architecture require? From a detection point of view, I think the ideal here is we want this to be real time, certainly sub-minute. We need it to be accurate, which means that there are both no false positives giving off false signals of attacks when in fact there's just organic changes in network traffic, for example, but also no false negatives, so you're not missing attacks. Because if you're missing attacks, then you're going to be spending a lot more time dealing with the collateral damage rather than perhaps looking at the more intrusive possible attacks that are happening underneath that volumetric attack. Detection should be flexible because there are multiple mitigation strategies available now. It should be supportive of automation and integration, and of course, always a concern is being cost effective. From a mitigation point of view, the ease of configuration is a major concern. It should be adaptable to cover and adapt to new types of attacks as they evolve. Automated. Now, this is an interesting one, and that automation is not necessarily very common in terms of mitigating attacks. There's a lot of human operator involvement still today in terms of taking something that looks like a detection and turning it into turning on mitigation. But automation really is how things need to happen. And then there are different deployment options, obviously, and we'll go into that a little bit more. And of course, mitigation needs to be cost effective as well. Now, an interesting statistic from the New Star Fall 2016 DDoS report is that globally, only 30% of attacks are detected in under an hour, which means that there is a significant lag in most cases. And a lot of that comes down to the lack of automation in detection to mitigation. In terms of the tech options for a defense architecture, from a detection point of view, you can run every single packet through some sort of stateful or deep packet inspection. That's an expensive way to go, but it's certainly one way to do it. The more common way is to look at traffic flow data and to monitor that and look for the patterns that indicate an attack using that kind of data. And different kinds of platforms can perform this, whether those be packaged appliances, downloadable software, or more recently, software as a service. From a mitigation technique point of view, there's the old school tried and true router ACL. There are a number of different common and less common ways of using control plane routing, protocol control plane signaling to essentially turn off traffic. So remote trigger black holes, which are let's say, specific way to do it. Flow spec, which is a little more specific way to do that. Open flow, which not very common in the wild, I would say, but has been demonstrated. Then, of course, there are the scrubbing types of approaches, which is where you have an appliance that's on-prem or that is located in a cloud scrubbing service, doing deep packet inspection and removing the attack traffic from the clean traffic. And of course, you can also take no action if there's not enough potential damage. If we look at how an end-to-end DDoS protection sort of flow occurs, you have traffic coming in, a mix of attack traffic and legitimate traffic. Most commonly now we have some traffic flow data that it's sent to some sort of detector, as we've mentioned, and that can then send an alert to an operator, which is still the most common way, who then either triggers something manually or uses some kind of script or something to signal to the infrastructure. There's also, that detector can also redirect traffic to a mitigation, either on-premises scrubbing box or to a cloud mitigation service. Now, in terms of the detection techniques, one of the challenges with detection appliances is that is really just the capacity limits of that sort of approach, computing approach, which is that if you're trying to run all these different functions, monitoring and signaling, et cetera, and you're taking in a large amount of traffic flow data, you run into constraints, just like if you open too many windows in a PC operating system, at some point it just runs out of memory and other capacity. And so as a result, there are a lot of compromises that have to be made in terms of how detection is done. For example, monitoring ranges of IP addresses rather than individual addresses. And so that's one compromise. Another one is that baselining may not be able to be performed on a network-wide basis, but rather on a per router or flow exporter basis. And then the way that monitoring is performed is oftentimes performed on a basis of just a single dimension, just looking at traffic going to that group of IP addresses. And that's limited because, for example, if you know that a lot of attack traffic may be coming from some countries that you don't do business in, you can't monitor and detect on that basis. The other limitation is that oftentimes policies are static, and as we all know, statically configured policies fall out of sync with reality rather rapidly, and that can decrease accuracy. One of the other constraints is that when you have an appliance, it just has a limited amount of storage, and you can't keep enough data around, and so oftentimes the only thing you get is a few summary reports. There's not a lot of analytics available for forensics and situational awareness. And finally, because so much work is put into the basic functions and the UI, oftentimes there's very limited APIs. So this is these are some of the limitations. The big data approach that Kentik has taken is really fundamentally different, which is that if you don't assume that you're limited to a single appliance and that you can use a scale-out approach to solving these same sort of detection and analytics problems, you can escape those constraints and do things in a much more scalable, granular, real-time, automated fashion. And really, that is the approach that we've taken. And I mentioned before that Kentik is processing over 125 billion traffic flow records per day today, and some other indicators of scale that you can achieve in a big data analytics platform are multi-terabit networks, very fast time from data ingest to the ability to process a detection or any other kind of query, the ability to respond within a very few seconds and take some kind of automated action, as well as the ability to retain raw, full data for months. And finally, the ease of being able to get started in that kind of cloud service fashion without having to install lots of hardware on site, which just takes longer. Our DDoS protection solution, you can think of it as the replacement for that detector appliance or software, where we are using that cloud scale and big data capability to track millions of individual host IPs per customer, do network-wide database lining, be able to look at things like source country and other factors in a monitoring and an alerting policy so they can be much more accurate, and do auto-adaptive baselining sets, meaning include anything that's interesting rather than have a static policy configuration. All right, so I'm gonna hand this back over to Joseph. But before we do, I'm going to share the results of our poll, which was, what is your primary business concern with DDoS? And the interesting distribution here. Clearly, there's a variety of concerns. One is brand protection. After that, in terms of maybe more of an end user or non-service provider point of view, is keeping digital business revenue flowing. So some kind of e-commerce or other sort of digital business is at stake here. Less common for this audience is access to cloud-based IT resources, less of a concern there. But there's also a mix of those who want to offer DDoS protection services and some consulting. And I don't know if you have any observations, Joseph?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me that it seems like we've got a nice blend here of perhaps service providers that want to be able to offer this as a service versus end users that are really more worried about what does this mean for their business. I think probably the thing that surprises me the most is that the brand protection is a little more important than perhaps keeping a digital business flowing. Brand protection is definitely an important part of it. When your customers have a bad experience, digitally, that definitely sticks with them. And I think that was part of the outcome from the Dyn DDoS. Not only did it affect Dyn themselves, it affected their customers and those customers' brands downstream.
Right. I think they are very much related, and maybe it says that a key concern that could be very much linked to digital business, the revenue aspect of it, is that maybe the short-term loss of some revenue may not be as primary concern as the long-term loss of brand loyalty, customer stickiness, and that sort of thing. Absolutely.
Very good point.
Okay, so I'm going to close those results, but I'm actually going to run another poll now, which is, and we'll just keep this open for a minute for folks to fill out if you can, which is, how tangible is the DDoS threat to your business? And these are some different choices here. Invite you to fill out this poll, whether or not this is a constant reality, something occasional. You're not under attack yet, but you're preparing for it, at least not that you know it, but you're preparing for it, or this is an academic concern only. So we'll give this just a minute for folks to pop in and fill out so we get a good high percentage of participation here, and just wait for that. So just addressing some of the results from the last poll while we're waiting, though, again, I think it is very interesting that we do have a lot of service provider concerns in terms of wanting to offer services, and that is something that has typically just been the domain of the largest telecom operators, I would say, in the past, but it's something that I think is now becoming, with the availability of more cloud-based services, something that maybe not the biggest of the big service providers can start to consider.
Well, Alex, I think it's also sort of the end result of, if you don't already have something in place and then you're targeted, typically that's the first phone call is to the service provider, to say, help me, you make this stop. and kind of as a result, the service provider, has to find a solution for it, right? And so that could be definitely be an attractive way to help customer service and find another income stream, perhaps, by offering DDoS service.
That's very true. Okay, so I'm going to close this poll so we can keep on moving. Just let me see if you have an issue with the slides again, just let me know and I'll advance it.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm just going to get into a couple of slides here, talking about recommendations, and these come directly out of Forrester's research into DDoS and some of our recommendations to clients. So this first is from a report. Yeah, Alex, you may need to go ahead and advance that. This first is from a report called "Develop a Two-Phase DDoS Mitigation Strategy," and it's really, looking at a couple of the things that Alex mentioned. I think are really important. So one, you've got downstream mitigation, and that may be near the application, near the things that you're trying to protect, near your network resources, and that may be in the form of a dedicated DDoS type appliance. A lot of businesses can't afford a dedicated DDoS type of appliance, or don't find enough use for that. It could also be from or features in your firewall or your IPS. I will caution that a lot of firewall and IPS type DDoS prevention will not handle really high volume attacks. It may not be foolproof, but it can give you the ability to quickly recognize an attack and do something about it near the source. There's two places you really want to think about protecting, right? Near the asset you're trying to protect, whether it's a data asset, a network asset, application, etc. And then you've got upstream mitigation, and that's more keeping the traffic from touching the edge of your network. And that's more of a cloud-based or a service provider-based type service. So in that scenario, you're really trying to keep all of the bad or volumetric type DDoS away from your network. Because when your network is saturated, then you will definitely have cascading problems from there, and not just the original target of the attack. You can definitely cascade downstream. And now let's advance the slides again. There we go. Another is to add DDoS to your incident response plan. In past lives where I worked for service providers, a very typical call from a DDoS victim would be, hey, we're having this in really incredibly high network volume, and it's causing failures. What can you guys do to help us? And really, our role at that point came to be trying to help them recognize the traffic, and then coordinating with their ISP or network provider to help block that traffic. And it definitely lengthened the amount of time that it took to stop the attack. And in that amount of time, damage is done, money is lost, and the expense of having all these people tied up together can be incredible. So as part of your incident response plan, you want to have DDoS in there. So first of all, who to call. You've got some sort of a mitigation technology. You've got a contract in place with some sort of a service provider, whether that's your ISP that may be reselling something, your ISP that's working on your behalf, or perhaps you're working with a cloud service provider. You want to have some sort of a notion of who you're going to call when you're in the middle of an incident. And then make sure you regularly test that plan. I know that's part of the regular incident response process recommendations, but it's really important. If you don't do the family fire drill about how do we all get out of the house in case of a fire, where do we meet out in front by the tree, then it doesn't become second nature to you, and then the stuff can get out of date. You can lose the names, the contact numbers, the contract may change. So it's really important to evaluate that plan and update it regularly. And Alex, one more advance there. And then the other is to plan in advance for potential service disruptions. And this is a direct result of the Dyn attack, where what we saw was the company behind the company was the result of the problem. People couldn't understand why things were failing. One of the things that had failed for a lot of people was two-factor authentication, which had another cascading effect. because the upstream service provider had failed, and we're all very reliant now on SaaS providers and cloud service providers of all types, that when these things happen, they can be very disruptive. So we really need to have a plan in place as well of how do we handle these things when they happen. And when we're working on new contracts with SaaS providers or cloud providers or what have you, ask them about their DDoS, their DDoS strategy. What do you do? What will the effect be if you're targeted? How do you protect yourself against it? Because by understanding how your vendor that you may rely on for things, how they could be affected, then you have a better idea of how to protect yourself and how to plan for that company's failure in case of a really severe incident. And Alex, if you can advance it one more time. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, and you can follow me at infosec under JB if you're on Twitter, or find me at forrester.com/Joseph Blankenship. So I'm going to hand it back over to Alex for the rest of the prezo, and then I think we have Q&A at the end of this.
That's right. So I'm just going to walk through a few more things here. Then we're going to share the results of our second poll, and then take a few questions. So one of the things I think that Joseph is really pointing to is that there's a shift to hybrid DDoS protection. And we see the move from appliances there's a move from appliances strictly being on-prem to being a hybrid approach, on-prem and in the cloud. We also see detection going cloud scale, SaaS, being able to span multiple mitigation techniques. We see that deep analytics is a must for effective security operations centers enablement. It's important for service provider offerings. And the other thing is that analytics aren't just about security. There's a lot about that you need to know from, for example, your network traffic that can tell you how you're doing as a business, particularly a digital business, and that's the real goal. So there's a large-scale shift to hybrid DDoS protection overall. Our DDoS protection solution really is about offering a cloud-based SaaS big data network analysis platform that can do extremely sophisticated anomaly detection. We can automate the mitigation of multiple techniques. Today we're integrated with Radware, with A10. We can automatically trigger BGP-based black holing. We have production deployments with all of those, and developments with others. So we have really a hybrid approach where we're providing this cloud scale detection and analytics engine that can trigger, automate, and then provide the analytics and forensics context for a defensive scheme. In terms of our analytics, we have what we would call unlimited ad hoc analytics. It's like if you imagine the ability to create a Hadoop data cube on the fly with multiple dimensions, looking at all sorts of different types of data, and run a multi-billion row analysis and get an answer back in a couple of seconds, and be able to do that ad hoc over and over as much as you want to really understand what's going on. That's the kind of capability that a big data engine can provide. And as an example, sort of the net effect of a big data approach is, I'm going to actually bring a regional service provider as an example, which is Penteledata. They are a New Jersey and Pennsylvania-based service provider, ISP. They had a legacy, let's say, solution that was based on more of these appliance-based detection, and they moved from that for a variety of reasons to Kentik's SaaS paired with, in this case, Radware Defense Pro. And what they found is that they caught 30% more attacks because of the increased accuracy of a big data approach to detection. But not only that, they also got much deeper visibility than they had into their business than they had before, and they are also looking to offer protection services as a result. Okay, so that's what I have to present. What I would like to do now is share the results of our last poll, which is, what do DDoS threats mean to your business? And so we can see here that for 44% of the attendees, this is constant. So a fairly strong majority are under attack on some basis, occasional, and a lot of folks are under attack very regularly. Others are not attacked yet. Nobody wants to admit that it's not a threat to them. If it is or not, I would concur that DDoS is, if you have any substantial business, it's going to be a threat if it isn't right now. Or it is happening on some level, and maybe it's just not quite reaching visibility yet. So again, Joseph, I don't know if you have any comments on this.
Well, I'd say this, Alex. I think we've got the right people on the phone, right? If we had a bunch of people saying it was not a threat, then I'd wonder why they were here on this webinar. So we definitely have the right people here. I am a little surprised at the number of folks that say that DDoS is a constant reality. I think that definitely speaks to the fact that the attacks have gotten much easier to carry out and have become almost commoditized to some degree, where it doesn't require a lot of expertise, and so then you can see the volumes ticking up. So that's definitely an interesting stat.
Right. They say that for less than the price of lunch, right, you can launch a DDoS attack, and there's a whole kind of industrialized, easy-to-use sector of attack tools out there in the dark web to go with. So those are some interesting results, and I'm going to now turn to any questions here. Let's see here. One question we have is, who should deploy completely on-premises DDoS defense systems? So obviously we've been talking a lot about cloud and hybrid, et cetera, and that's one question that was raised.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that. I don't know that it makes a lot of sense for anybody at this stage of the game to go completely on-prem, aside from service providers. There's probably a good case that if you're a service provider and you don't necessarily want to be a third party, passing through the revenue, or even the having to deal with a third party vendor, that you may want to have your own equipment, administer it yourself, and then manage that on behalf of your customers. But in terms of commercial, I don't know that is a really viable or advisable way to approach this threat at this stage, especially the really large volumetric type of attacks we've seen. Okay, great.
One other question came up, which is really more about the availability of SaaS versus on-premises deployments for big data solutions, particularly for places that have data sovereignty, data privacy requirements. And I want to just mention that Kentik actually does deploy on-premises big data clusters, and we have done so, are doing so for service providers, particularly globally, but also some large cloud providers and others in the US. So that's something that is available. The one other question, and I know we're approaching our time, is the question that I think jumps off some of the discussion we had about service providers, which is that we talked to our two ISPs, neither of whom had a very complete solution. When is DDoS defense going to be a standard offering from ISPs? I think it's a really interesting question. I think it says a lot about the state of the market in overall, but maybe Joseph, you could comment first, and I can add a few comments to that.
Sure, yeah, happy to. I think a lot of it has to do, with how experienced the ISP is with DDoS or network security in general, right? It may not be a core competency of theirs, but you have to wonder, if it would make a lot of sense for ISPs to at least have a partner, a go-to partner in the space for their customers. And I think it's really about market demand. I don't know that all ISPs, maybe the really large folks that already offer, DDoS mitigation as a service, they already have, that type of expertise. But I don't really think we're going to see, smaller ISPs beyond the really large guys, kind of develop out that expertise or buy the necessary equipment, because it's expensive. It's expensive to maintain the people as well as the products, right? The systems. So maybe it makes a lot of sense to partner for it, or be a channel partner with another service provider.
Right, and I think that the fact that there are more cloud-based options reduce the upfront investment. Also, the ability for detection to be more accurate and therefore be more automated makes a big difference in the cost of deployment. By comparison, to have a bunch of staff in a SOC looking at the equivalent, alerting equivalent of emails with a whole bunch of information in them, and they have to try to parse out what those mean and then hit a button. When you can automate more of the mitigation based on highly accurate detection, you also cut down the amount of staff intervention needed to operate a service. And one of the things, just as a comment back to the case study I mentioned with Pentelidata, is that they are running primarily in full automatic mitigation mode, that after looking at what kinds of detection they were seeing, they got to a level of confidence that they were willing to go into automatic mitigation triggering. And so I think the accuracy of cloud scale and big data can make a difference in terms of the feasibility of offering a service when you're not some giant organization with a huge security operations center staff. We have one more question, which is, how do we ensure that this product continues working if it is cloud-based during a DDoS event? That is a good question in general for any kind of cloud-based system, right? Whether or not it's Kentik or any kind of cloud service provider. I'll take a stab at it from the Kentik point of view, which is that I think and I think, Joseph, you mentioned the need to really understand what is the resilience, scale, and really the scale and resilience of any kind of cloud-based service, whether or not it's for your computing or for DDoS detection or analytics or any of that sort of thing. Understanding the scale and the capability to scale out against an attack to handle, for example, to handle the volume of traffic that you may be sending to it at any given time is important. I think another thing, obviously, is looking at what kind of practices and defensive practices does any cloud provider have, including us. And that's something that we obviously have to brief our customers on. One of the things I'll just say is, from a scale point of view, the scale of our engine is so much massively more than any appliance can be, that it is, I think that's a major good comparison point to an appliance-based approach, no matter where that appliance lives. The other aspect to it is it's something that you get to know with a vendor, which is, what's your connectivity like? What kind of redundancy and failure, sort of failover kind of measures do you have in place? What kind of credibility does that team have in operating, high-scale operations? From our point of view, we have the background of folks who've run the global CDN for, Akamai and for Netflix and YouTube and those kinds of organizations, whether they have the experience of dealing with massive DDoS attacks and, dealing with scale and dealing with those sorts of resilience issues. But ultimately, obviously, you have to get to a level of confidence with any cloud provider for that. And I don't know, Joseph, if you want to comment further more generally.
Well, that's a tough question, right? I think you're really putting your hands in any service providers. You're putting your business in any service provider's hands, right? Whether it's your big data service provider for DDoS or anything else when you're going for any SaaS service. So it really, to my mind, it goes right back to what Alex said. What is their plan for resiliency? How prepared are they to defend against these types of attacks? And fortunately, these are the types of questions we're asking during procurement cycles now, right? Is to really understand what type of protections do our service providers have in place before we turn to them. But that's a fantastic question.
Right, and very important for any kind of cloud service, for sure.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, not just the big data guys. Yep.
Exactly. And we're no exception, and we wouldn't want to be. At this point, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for attending. We will send a link to the recording of this webinar out to all the attendees and registrants. If you want to get more information about Kentik, you can visit us at kentik.com. While you're on that website, there is a button to start a free trial. You can be using the product in 15 minutes if you're ready to start sending some data to us. You could also request a demo on our website or email us at info@kentik.com. So on behalf of Kentik, and I want to thank you, Joseph, for your time today. It's really great hearing your perspectives, great information, and I want to thank everyone who's attended and wish everyone a great rest of the day.